So I am very pleased to be here with Alexandra Horowitz, the filmmaker behind Reawakening, and I'll introduce her briefly for those in attendance and those viewing after the fact, and then we'll get started with the Q&A. So I should say I'm Neal Schindler. I'm the co-chair of the Spokane Jewish Cultural Film Festival. Looks like we have a couple more folks coming in. And our guest is Alexandra Horowitz, a former senior producer at CNN International, who spent nearly 10 years covering business and economics for CNN and its various networks from bureaus in New York, Washington, London, and Hong Kong. She now works independently as a writer, director, and producer of documentary shorts for nonprofits, often on subjects related to Judaism. She's produced films for the Jewish Museum of Maryland, the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, and Washington, D.C.'s Theater Lab, and her writing has appeared in the Washington Post. So welcome, Alexandra. It's really good to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to start off with kind of an opening question, but I want to let everyone who's attending know at any point, feel free to put questions or comments in the chat, and we'll definitely fold them into the conversation. So to start off with, I'd like to know what compelled you to make this film.
I think what compelled me to make the film most was that I felt like this was a very public anti-Semitic event that happened in Charlottesville, and I don't feel like the anti-Semitic angle of it was covered very much by the mass media, and it was really used as the organizing principle to put this rally together. And you know, it's not that anti-Semitism is better or worse or competing with any other form of hate, right? I mean, it's all hate and it's all intolerance. But I felt that there was a very specific anti-Semitic angle to it that wasn't getting the coverage. So that's what it was initially.
I think about the chant, Jews will not replace us, which, considering how blatant that was, I think you're right. There was focus, but it was more in Jewish media than in large media on that particular aspect. So I'm interested to know, what was your process in terms of approaching the synagogue community, Congregation Beth Israel, and getting their blessing and cooperation for the making of the film?
So I really lucked out, actually, which is that about a year before I started producing the film, I had another Jewish organization I was involved in had a retreat in Charlottesville, and we met with clergy and members of the synagogue community, and we heard all their stories about that weekend and about events leading up to that weekend. And so I got to know some individual members of the community. And one of the people I got to know, this film is based on an oral history, much of which was pre-recorded before I started producing the film. And I got to know the professor who was directing that oral history project. And so we were talking for about a year on and off about looking for ways that we could combine her work and my work. And eventually it led to this. So I was lucky in that I already had someone, excuse me, someone in the community who was on board with the project.
It looks like we have our first audience question. Were there individuals that you interviewed whose comments did not get included in the film? And if so, how did you make the choices as to whom to include and whom not to include?
So the professor I mentioned, she did this very wide-ranging oral history recorded on video of the Charlottesville Jewish community, of her synagogue community, which is the only synagogue it's not the only congregation in Charlottesville, but it's the only synagogue in Charlottesville, and it's been there since the 19th century. And she was not specifically focusing on the Unite the Right events, but obviously it came up. And so when she would send me interviews, right? These long 1.5 hour, 2 hour interviews that would have a few questions on Charlottesville. There weren't many, or on the Unite the Right events. There weren't many that I left out. Honestly, the ones that I did, I left out for time purposes, that I didn't have this space in the film, right? I mean, it was initially supposed to be 5 minutes. It ended up being almost 8 minutes. You have to make the decisions, and the decisions, I think, end up being which sound bites are going to tell this story most effectively and are going to move the story along, right? You may have 3 great sound bites that say the same thing, but you don't necessarily have the space to include them. So you pick one.
Right, right. And I imagine there must have been, considering still a very short film, there must have been some difficult decisions to make in that process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you want to include a lot, right? Always.
I'm curious I'm curious about why the choice to make a short and not a longer film, a feature film.
I think budget is always a choice. And also, I mean, largely budget and time and very sort of practical reasons. But I also think that the advantages of a short film are that, in a way, you can't go into the subject in as much depth, but I almost feel like you get more bang for your buck because you can spark the conversations that happen at film festivals like this or at event. We've done a lot of events with the film at Jewish museums and synagogues and other Jewish organizations. And so I feel like with a short film, you can spark those conversations that you would also spark with a longer film, but you're not spending years doing fundraising and years doing shooting. And so the actual film itself, I know people always want more information than the film gives, but in terms of the ultimate goal of the film, which is to make people think and to make people have conversations, that can be done just as effectively for a lot less money and time as a short film. And I also personally, I mean, I worked in daily news for over a decade, and I just like the immediate, the quick turnaround, that you have an idea and you put it together and that, you get it done and get the idea out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we've all seen films, whether documentary or narrative, that go over similar points repeatedly in an attempt to emphasize it. It isn't always as effective as kind of a shorter presentation. I thought that the points, particularly some of the statements from the community members, really resonated for me in a way that for such a short film, it really packs kind of a bigger wallop than than one might initially expect, seeing that the length is 8 minutes. Yeah, so we have another audience question, and it kind of is similar to something I was going to ask, so that's great. Have you followed up with the community such that what kind of solidarity work is going on between the Jewish community and the Black community, sort of things that they've accomplished?
So I have not stayed actually in very close contact. I've stayed in touch with a couple of individuals, one of whom has actually left the Charlottesville area since then. So I don't know. I know that it's something that was important to them and they were committed to, but in terms of the specifics, I don't really know what's happened since then.
Fair enough. Yeah, I did a little reading before our Q&A, and I learned that Rabbi Rachel has moved to a different...
Yeah, to my neck of the woods, actually.
Oh, has she really? Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciated her statements in the film, and also some of the articles she was either featured in, the slate.com interview, which I could actually post in the chat for people to see later. But yeah, no, I was It was definitely interesting to hear from both rabbis in terms of their views on political
Mhm.
engagement in their role as rabbis, and also things that they've learned in the process, for sure. Um, so I'm wondering whether your experience of making the film has influenced or affected how you viewed sort of the events that have come in the last few years, up to and including the January 6th insurrection that we were talking about just
Um,
before the Q&A.
Yeah, I think it has influenced them a lot. I think Rabbi Goodhertz, Tom Goodhertz, who continues to be the senior rabbi in Charlottesville, he called the August Unite the Right events a national coming out party for the alt-right. He called that at the time, and I think that the events since then have been much more public and much more violent than we saw before that. And if you think of things like the lockdown protests that happened in Michigan, where people brought guns into the state capitol, what else? I mean, certainly the Capitol, the Washington D.C. Capitol riot, that there's a level of sort of public violence, the kidnapping plot to kidnap the Michigan governor this fall. There was a plot also allegedly to kidnap the Virginia governor, that we're just seeing a level of extremism and violence publicly that that sort of built up to the Capitol. So almost like little by little, our tolerance for it we were becoming sensitized to it.
Right, and looking back, it's possible. Oh, go ahead.
That's it. I was just.
Looking back, it's possible to see the Unite the Right rally as kind of a go-ahead for the things that would follow on the same timeline as you're saying, and it's so strange that at that time, of course, we didn't know what was coming, or that things would continue in that vein, or get even worse in some cases. So
yeah. And I think also the disinformation that made it possible, even though it wasn't exactly the same, right? In Charlottesville, you have the Jews are controlling the world as kind of the organizing principle. And in the Capitol right here, you have the sort of false narratives about the presidential election. But I think that there are parallels in the willingness of sort of the people who perpetrated these events to believe false narratives and not to question these narratives. And so, there are parallels, definitely.
So we have another question from the audience. Any thoughts on recommendations for what a layperson like me can do to counter this public violence?
I would say get in touch with local organizations that, like ADL or other anti-hate organizations that work on this, and find out what they're doing in the local community. I think it's important to be able to recognize anti-Semitism and the forms it can take, and to see echoes of kind of anti-Semitic tropes and things that maybe prior to the last few years we wouldn't necessarily have recognized. And I say that as someone who grew up in the Northeast and never really met anti-Semitism firsthand. And so, a lot of these conspiracy theories have their origins in kind of centuries of the blood libel and Jews being Christ killers and the protocols of the elders of Zion and Jews taking over the world, that it's important to be able to recognize them when they surface, because they do surface, and they surface in a way that is used to organize the far right. There's a place called the Western States Center. You can look on their website too for more information on this, but their executive director, Eric Ward, I heard him speak a couple of months ago, and he actually said that anti-Semitism is possibly more of a threat to non-Jews than to Jews because of the way it's manipulated to organize other forms of hate. And I think, you know, we sort of see that in the parallels between Charlottesville and the Capitol.
We actually, we have a staff member of Western State Center who works out of Spokane here, and he was our guest quite a few weeks ago for a virtual program.
Yeah.
So it was good to have that perspective, but I also years ago attended a local forum on anti-Semitism, and the speaker, one of the things he wanted us to read before arriving was an essay by Eric Ward called Skin in the Game, and it was about exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So recommended to anyone who's interested in that organization's work and the sort of understanding of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. So I think if people want to fight anti-Semitism sort of around them, and not just anti-Semitism, but it's connected to other forms of hate, obviously racism and intolerance across the spectrum, that to look to what organizations like the Western State Center or ADL and other organizations are doing.
Mm-hmm. So as a filmmaker, were there specific things that you can say you learned in the course of making this particular film?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot more about anti-Semitism and the far right than I ever knew or encountered before. I think that would be the primary thing. And I think I also learned that, you know, you don't need an enormous budget to make a film that can have an impact or that can spark discussions, that, you know, they can be smaller projects. And none of this film was professionally shot. Most of the interviews were shot by the professor I mentioned and a volunteer. And then the interviews that I shot, I actually specifically shot them myself with the same camera because I wanted the look to be the same. So not only did I not have the budget for them to be professionally shot, but it was very convenient that even if I had the budget, it would have not, the look of the interviews would not have been consistent. So, you know, so I think you can do a lot with a little.
Mm-hmm. Right. Certainly good to remember for anyone who's interested in becoming a filmmaker or in getting involved in any way in filmmaking, because I think it often seems very daunting from that perspective of actually being able to produce the films. So, yes, someone's asking something I was also going to ask, which is, what are you working on these days?
So I just launched I don't know what to call it, a company, I guess. It's me. And it's called Voices, Storytelling, and Media. And it is, what my goal is to work with museums and nonprofit organizations, historical societies, and cultural organizations to look at history and also at contemporary issues through a historical, to give historical perspective to those. And so working with oral histories and working with organizations, and that's what I'm working on. Yeah,
that's good to hear. And if you're ever in our region, I can refer you to our friends at the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, who do a lot of great work. So I don't know that you make it out here that often, but if you they'd be good people to know.
Yeah. Thank you. That'd be helpful.
Sure. Are there particular challenges that you encountered in the course of making the film?
I think budget mostly, even though it was a very small budget, it still needed a budget. And I think finding archival material is, it's a film, and a lot of my work is based on using archival material, in some cases almost exclusively, like in this film. And it's not always easy to find what you need, so it's a lot of hunting around online, and you're not necessarily shooting everything that you're going to use. It's a lot of research for pictures and tracking down, if you see something on somebody's Facebook page, kind of tracking them down, and is it okay to use it? Can they send you the original, because you don't just want to take it off the web? And that was the biggest challenge, I think.
So this is the $64,000 question here from Judy. Do you have any recommendation on how to counter misinformation to someone who believes it? Boy. No, I mean, it's not my field of expertise, right? It's the $1 million question right now. Again, I guess I would look to the people who do that. I'm sure there are organizations online. I'm sure ADL, does that. But I'm sure you can find, either through universities or other organizations, that there are people who know a lot more about that than I do. Rewatching the film today, I was struck by how it feels different to see in the time since we had in early February, an incident here in Spokane where someone who has now been arrested drew with graffiti 2 swastikas and a white power symbol on our temple building, which is not something that hadn't happened in some way before, but it felt different. Something like that happened in 2014, and that was a different time, a different political landscape, it seems like now. But just what struck me, of course, it's very different, that incident, from what you were documenting, through the testimonies of the community members of Charlottesville. But some things were similar in terms of members of our community wanting to respond by engaging even more in their Jewishness, their Jewish identity, feeling and wanting and receiving support from outside the Jewish community in solidarity, and then using this as an impetus to pursue with even greater energy anti-racist work, tikkun olam, and interfaith work as well. So I really was struck by those parallels, even though the actual incidents, of course, are very, very different. But it's something that I think we've heard echoes of when there have been anti-Semitic incidents around the country, and perhaps beyond just the border.
Yeah, I think that's true. I definitely think that's true. And, I think it's heartening that support comes from beyond the Jewish community, right? Like, this isn't Germany in 1939. Like, we get support at Pittsburgh after the shooting, got a lot of support from the rest of the community, the non-Jewish community. And I think in many cases it has encouraged the Jewish community to look beyond itself and draw parallels.
Right. I was moved by both Rabbi Rachel's, I wish I remembered her last name, Schmelkin?
Schmelkin, yeah.
Her sort of description of Jews as resistors throughout history, kind of using that very very au courant term to kind of look back at even Purim and Pesach and those stories, but also particularly Rabbi Tom's closing statement about sort of the fight for racial justice and anti-white supremacy, saying everyone has a part to play, reminded me of the oft-quoted statement from Pirkei Avot, you're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. And it seems like that's something that kind of runs through the film with a variety of community members, both lay and leaders, saying that they feel that they, may not have felt as much that they had a part to play, but now they know they do. So it's really
Yeah.
interesting to observe.
No, I think that's definitely true, that they felt, whether they identified strongly as Jewish or not before, like you were saying, that they felt that, and that they felt they had a role in the Jewish community and or bridging gaps between the Jewish community and the greater community. What I love about that soundbite of Rabbi Rachel's that you mentioned is that you can see her in that, like you can almost see the thought process evolving, and then she kind of hits on it, and it's sort of her face lights up. So.
Yeah. Well, I since we have such a small group today, I would love to hear if anyone in the audience has any particular thoughts or things that struck them, things that resonated for them about the film. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like. I just want to kind of bring in anyone's voices who want to be included. Also fine if you'd rather not, but I want to open it up for that. Because I have a few more questions, but I figured I'd give folks a chance to chime in if they wanted. Okay. So one thing I'm curious to know is whether there are any projects you've done in the past that particularly that meant a lot to you, that were particularly memorable or important to you, that you wouldn't mind telling us about.
I did a piece a few years ago. It's on, I think it's on the Capitol Jewish Museum website or YouTube page. And it was a profile. And again, it was done from an oral history that already existed. And I went out and I found the visuals, but it was a profile of a Holocaust survivor who had moved to the United States in the 1950s, and she had gotten involved in the civil rights movement, and she had gone down and worked in a freedom school in Mississippi. And it was again a short piece, just about 7.5 minutes, and it started out with her experience in the Holocaust, and she went into hiding, and then Hamburg was bombed, and she and her family were presumed to be dead because the city had been bombed. And so that enabled them to, sort of to disappear off the map. And then she drew parallels between her experience after she came to the United States and seeing the racism. She lives in the Washington, D.C. area. So she talks about how the racism in this area, and she talked about it in New York also too, when she lived there. Sort of the parallels she saw between Germany and that, and why that compelled her to become involved in the civil rights movement. And so that was a really meaningful piece, and she loaned me for it. And I remember being so nervous in the few days that I had it that I really had to protect these photos. She had these tiny photos. I mean, they were little, and we used them in the film. They were pictures that her father had taken after the bombing of Hamburg of their neighborhood. So it was just this incredible story. And yeah, and it was parallel to this film in that it was based on an oral history, and I sort of cut down the oral history and then found the archival footage to go with it. So
very good. Excuse me. Yeah, I was just speaking with another filmmaker yesterday about the need for documentarians to earn the trust of their subjects and how that can come to pass and what that means. Mm-hmm. And so your anecdote kind of makes me think very much of that's kind of how if someone's willing to lend you materials that are so that are of such historical significance and familial significance.
Yeah. And I remember using them as quickly as I could and bringing them back to her because I just didn't want to be responsible for keeping them.
Sure.
But But I guess I have found people pretty trusting and pretty willing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know if it's the Jewish connection or
Mm.
the subject matter, but I haven't so much found a lot of resistance.
I would bet that in some cases it's also that people love to have and often feel they lack a venue for telling their stories,
Mhm.
whatever those may be, whatever the particular subject. And
Mm.
often folks, I think, will be very eager to do that.
Yeah. And I guess I always had an intermediary sort of in the community, or somebody trusted who was the common link between the subject and me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. In some cases, I think I'm just thinking to one where I didn't really have a connection. I mean, I think in some cases it's just like you say, once you show your interest and you show, I think your integrity, or that you're not sort of out to get them, but you want to tell their story, that
Mm-hmm.
after a while people trust you.
Yeah, which I mean, it makes me think also of how much distrust has been sown uh, regarding the media, and that's not what we're talking about today. But
Right,
I'm
right. No, it's different, obviously, if
yes,
you're in the media and it's for a story that's going on national television,
mm-hmm.
right? But
And also,
sometimes I think if you have to travel to someone, right? If they're not necessarily 10 minutes away from where you live, but an hour or so away, and you have to travel there and you make the effort, and you've talked to them before and done it when it's convenient for them, and that there's already kind of a trust building up.
mm-hmm. That makes sense. Well, Alexandra, that's all I have in terms of the questions I'd prepared, but I wonder if there's anything else that I didn't ask about that you think it might be good for our audience to know about the film, the process of making it, anything like that, your work as a filmmaker.
Um, Trying to think. Um, no, not no. I mean, I think you've covered a lot of it.
Okay.
I mean, I do think that since we're in this environment of polarization and hate, um, uh, sort of our way into these conversations um, is often through our experience as Jews, and that if we can look at the way that hate against us is still manipulated, uh, then then I think we should use that um, in working with others who are also victims of hate.
So full disclosure, my mom is on this Zoom meeting as well, Rosalind Schindler, and she has, I think, either a comment or a question. So I'll let her go ahead and chime in.
Thank you. Thanks, Neal. And thanks, Alexandra. I very much appreciated the film. Um, I have learned through my own experiences as the daughter of Holocaust survivors not to use the word enjoy, because it's not something to be enjoyed, it's something to be appreciated and cherished. Your comments about Hamburg resonated with me, with the bombing of Hamburg, because my mother was from Hamburg. She was a Holocaust survivor.
Mhm.
And I included a lot of her experiences, of course, in Hamburg. And when I took her back to Hamburg after decades, in the memoir that I wrote about her. And one of the things that I wanted to mention, and it kind of relates to your film and films in general about anti-Semitism and bigotry and racism and so forth. Um, when I wrote the memoir in 2007, um, it took me 2 years to finally self-publish it. I tried to get it published by a publisher, university publisher. I was a professor at Wayne State University in Detroit for 42 years.
Oh,
And
you were?
yeah,
Okay, I went to Michigan.
oh, okay. Um,
Are you
anyway,
a law professor?
no. I taught interdisciplinary studies, German, and Holocaust studies. Um,
Mhm.
and anyway, when I tried to get the memoir published, I had a variety of reactions. It's just over 100 pages, and a few of the publishers wrote back to me and said that they appreciated reading it and it was very good, but it was too short, and they wanted me to double its length. And I said, I don't have double its length in me. Otherwise, I would have written that to begin with.
Right.
So that didn't work out. But a few of them said, we are not publishing Holocaust memoirs anymore because there are enough out there. Well, since I had the opportunity to exchange thoughts with those publishers, I simply wrote back and I said that for something like the Holocaust or anything like that, we need as many voices as possible to create a kaleidoscope of memories and experiences. And your film and others like it, whether that length or longer, mean to me, as the daughter of Holocaust survivors, that we need more and more of those kinds of documentations, whether they're in film or whether they're in written form or in poetic form, in any form. It's very different now. We're in the 21st century, so so many more things are possible of publication in various formats on various platforms. But one of the things that I consider really important, and I think it speaks, Judy, to one of the questions you asked about countering misinformation and what a layperson can do to counter public violence. It's truthful information. It's bringing to light what we know to be true, and to document it. And it may or may not resonate with people who simply don't believe it, but it is very important. Elie Wiesel said a number of things on this point, that if we don't bring it to light, it dies. It dies along with, in this case, the survivors. And so with all that said, I really appreciate your film.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I will afterwards, I will send Neal the link to the YouTube page, because you might be interested in seeing the short film on the woman from Hamburg.
I absolutely would.
I can send that. But I mean, back to your point, or Judy's point, about misinformation. We're living in a time with so many information streams, and I just heard an interview a couple of weeks ago with someone saying, well, how do you deal with the fact that, I mean, in this environment of polarization, people aren't even getting their information from the same streams, right? So you don't have a common set of facts that people agree on. It's not a question of interpreting the facts differently. People are getting different streams of facts, and it's obviously a very dangerous thing. And I don't know personally what the answer is, but I'm sure that there are organizations out there that are studying sort of how the internet is being used, and kind of responsible internet use. And I mean, there must be dozens of them in Washington, in this Washington where I am, and around the country at universities. So,
well, and I think that I've heard a few different commentators on this subject, and one pointed out that some of it's generational. If we teach media literacy more consistently now to younger people, we're more likely to have a generation with more of it, sort of already inculcated. And then, even though it seems like the path to a situation where people feel they have different facts and seem to be in different realities, it seems like that only took 5 years, but it actually in some ways took decades to get us to this point. And it may take, unfortunately, a while to get back out. But I think it's
yeah.
something.
And you have to teach critical thinking skills, right? I mean, the critical thinking curriculum in our schools, it's, I mean, I think that the riot personally it's a failure of a lot of things in our society, but one of them is education.
Definitely.
So.
Well, I think we're just about at the end of our time, and I think that's a good note to end on. But I really appreciate your taking time out of your day and your week, Alexandra, to join us.
Oh, no, it's great. Thank you so much for asking me and for including the film in your festival. I mean, it's so wonderful to be a part of it. So
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it.
And I'd love to keep in touch and learn about the other
Absolutely.
projects you're working on. So,
Absolutely.
all right. Well, thank you also to our
All right.
audience today. Appreciate your questions and comments, and really good to see all of you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.